Hi everyone, welcome. In this tub over here I've got a bin of red wiggler worms, and in this bin alone we've been doing a little pattern of feeding that we refer to as pocket feedings. So if you think of the pockets as the pockets on a billiard table, then those pockets are, well, there's a couple located across the middle, but the other ones are all in the corners. So that's the reason why we call it pocket feedings, kind of similar to a billiard table. And every time we come in to feed, we rotate one corner clockwise. So far there have been 8 such pocket feedings in the system. 10 feedings overall. The first 2 feedings were not done that way, and we started into this pocket feeding routine on feeding number 3. And there have been 10 feedings so far. So today for feeding number 11, I've got some Brussels sprout and this corner marker, this piece of white triangular paper, I'm going to be using as our feeding zone indicator, because every time we've come in here so far, we've always found that the worms have nibbled away the coffee filter that was used as their feeding zone indicator. So I'm kind of assuming that we're going to see the same thing, no feeding zone indicator remaining. And it was also a little interesting thing that we placed on top of the feeding zone indicator, a little feather. So I'm curious to see if that's still in there too. So we're going to get the system up on the bench, we're going to get it fed. Now before we get started, I know we already talked about the 8 pocket feedings and the 10 feedings overall, but the age of the system as of today, 127 days old, and it's been 10 days since we last checked in here. So I figured I'd cover these bits before I forgot to share it with you. Now we can get started. So let's see what we see. This idea of, oh, well, that's a little bit surprising. In previous check-ins, we've found our feeding zone indicator to always be pretty much gone, and that's part of the reason I sort of expected that to be the case today too, but it seems like our feeding zone indicator has survived, and it also seems like our feather has survived as well. And to tell you the truth, I wouldn't have even remembered to check on this feather if it had not been for a quick review of the last video. I had completely forgotten about it, and it was just breezing through the video from last time that I noticed it. And you know what? I guess since that's the case, we'll just keep using it. Usually when I've got stuff like this that has survived between feedings, I'm all for sticking with it. So we did sprinkle the leaves that were used as a top coating out in such a way that it wasn't really positioned over the feeding zone. So I don't think that this is evidence of the worms just consuming the leaves that were there. I think the leaves were just not put there in the first place. And the one thing we've been doing is using this top coating of leafy material as the bedding for our feedings. And we got a whole lot of it on this go around. You know, I did check how many days were typically in between our pocket feedings, and they went anywhere from 11 days to 14 days. So the 10-day interval that we're going with today is the shortest time in between check-ins, and perhaps if we've gone another 4 days or more, then perhaps more of this top coating material would have been consumed by the worms. But you know, it seems like we might have come back in here a little earlier than it would have taken for them to do away with more of this top coating stuff. So you know what? They get even that much more bedding material to accompany their feeding. So I'm going to move the feeding zone indicator to the location where we're going to feed today. Since the last feeding was here, one move over clockwise is going to bring us back to square one. That's the corner where we started. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now the 9th pocket feeding returns us to the corner where we started. So as we usually do, instead of going straight for the feeding, we're going to check with the last feeding, where we used some really moldy bread and some really spoiled avocado as the feeding. And I am curious to see what we're left with here today. So I do see some avocado, but for some reason I thought that the avocado had been placed in here in such a way that it was already shelled and had its pits removed. So the fact that we've got a avocado here that's in its shell is a little bit confusing. I think that the other stuff that we're seeing in here might be remnants of bread. A lot of times when bread doesn't get consumed entirely, it starts to take on this sort of white, pasty look. So I think we're seeing clear evidence of a lot of leftovers from the last feeding. But hey, you know, when has the presence of lots of leftovers ever dissuaded me from moving ahead with a planned feeding? It's a pretty rare occurrence. So it does seem like they've still got a little bit of work to do in order to complete the last feeding that they were given over here. But that's part of the reason I like these pocket feedings, is because this feeding of avocado and bread can simply continue as is. We'll simply load all the leftovers right back into the corner where it belongs and let it continue. And I assume that by the next time we come back in here, we'll probably see much less of this stuff in here. But I didn't really know what to expect. You know, after 10 days, I guess I had a sneaky suspicion that perhaps there would be a good many leftovers, and it did actually turn out to be exactly that. So it does seem like we would probably want to cover up this feeding zone pretty good. I don't think that this is necessary. You know what, let's hang on to these leaves that I collected in the beginning. Those will become the foundation for today's feeding over there. And I've got my box of leaves with which we can definitely put a nice thick coating over this entire system once again, the way we did last time. But I'd like to move on. I'd like to move over to this corner where, again, just in a quick review of the last feeding, I do remember this corner getting excavated to see how things were coming along, and there were still leftovers of the tortilla that had been put in here. And that's what I believe we're seeing of some here. We're seeing little bits of tortilla left over, and I think this other stuff, it's pretty distinct. The appearance of it is very unique and doesn't look like anything else. The rinds of the cantaloupe are always very obvious, and it does look like that was another feeding, of which there are still a few leftovers, but not quite as much as we saw of the last feeding from 10 days ago. There's a good many worms hanging out down here. It's just kind of fun to run your fingers through some materials and feel all the worms in between your fingers. Just for fun, sometimes we like to get a little close-up of these little guys, so let's do the same today. Look at them squirm. Now, the other thing I noticed distinctly while I was screening the video from last time was how these two corners, these two corners were pretty busy, or at least, well, this corner was pretty busy still. But when we started backtracking to the opposite end, to the feedings gone by, I don't even know how much time has gone between now and these corners having been fed. There wasn't a whole lot of activity even last week over here on this side, so I'm not expecting to see a whole lot of action over there today either, but just for good measure, we're going to continue on in a clockwise pattern to see how this corner is doing now after I don't know how much time. So yeah, there's a good bit of moisture here and a few worms, but certainly nothing like we saw in that corner where the cantaloupe had been, and even where the avocado and moldy bread had been placed last time 10 days ago. There was a good number of worms over on this side. I was kind of expecting not to see a whole lot over here, and I believe that by the time we get over to this corner that we're feeding today, the corner that has been fed it's been the longest period of time since we last checked in on this corner, it's pretty likely that we're going to see even less of a turnout over here. So I guess the one thing I am noticing is a good bit of moisture. So I feel like I'd like to shove things in a bit more, if possible, to leave a whole lot of room, since we do have a fair bit of this bedding material to be used down here. want to make sure we leave ourselves ample space to drop all of this in here, onto which we can put today's feeding. It almost does seem like the bedding that they're getting to accompany today's feeding outweighs significantly the food portion. Well, I don't know, it's hard to say. It just kind of looks that way to me. And, well, I think maybe we'll just have to come up with some other use for this triangular piece of paper, because I do like the idea of just going with a piece of coffee filter that survived since the last check-in. Let's just continue using that as the feeding zone indicator if it's still capable. I'm going to sprinkle some pulverized eggshell in on top of this Brussels sprout. And in case you're kind of new to the whole worm farming game, the crushed eggshell is stuff that the worms utilize as grit down in their gizzards to break down the foods that they consume. And people use various different things. Some people just use sand or rock dust or pulverized crustacean shell. You know, there's a variety of different materials that could be used as grit in a worm bin. For me, eggs are just the convenient material to use. So I think that pretty much brings us to the end here. And you know, what did I end up doing with that little feather? I kind of figured I would return to having the feather resting out on top of this coffee filter, but I was careless and I've misplaced it. And it doesn't really matter. I had already forgotten about it anyway, so I think I'll forget about it equally as quick on this go around too. So let's follow up here with the final step of giving them a whole bunch of nice leafy material. And the new thing I've been doing these days is trying to see if I can remove any stuff that's stuck to my gloves with the leafy material if I'm using it. This way it seems like I'm keeping as much in the bin as possible versus allowing it to be lost. And the leafy material I like a lot because I'm sure the worms like it. But I also like the fact that after it's been sitting in the bin for, you know, a little while, it's all full of all the microbiology that really helps break down the materials that are being fed to the wormies. And not only that, but it probably makes the leaves themselves into a much more appetizing material for the worms to nibble on too. So the stuff I'm spraying in here is just some mosquito dunks solution. It's the BTI bacteria, which helps control mosquitoes. If you've got a pond or any sort of standing water on your property, you might have used this stuff. But it also has a tendency to help get rid of gnats. So since I've got gnats here and there in some of my systems, I've been trying to get in the habit of using this stuff, even in places where I just don't see any gnat activity. So in the case of this system, I'm really just kind of using it as a preventative measure. So that brings us to the end of our check-in with this now 127-day-old red wiggler worm bin. Pocket feeding number 9 going in. Overall feeding number 11. And I guess I'll be curious to see how they do on those Brussels sprout leaves. Something tells me that those are going to be popular and we might not see many leftovers next time we come back in here. So on that note, let me just bid you farewell. And before I do, let me just ask you kindly, if you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's all very much appreciated. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye now.